I don't know the purpose of the lockdown was designed
to hurt poor people.
To hurt poor people, but there's no question that was the outcome. And that's the gist of our report. It's the unequal opportunities and the unequal outcomes that have been created by this. And so it's not because a market economy lets some people get rich and some not. I'm all for that. This was policy driven. It was enforced at gunpoint by government officials. It's not right.
Well, we're all recovered, right? The economy is back here in Colorado. There was no real cost from all the government mandated shutdowns. I'm thrilled to hear that. We're back better than ever before. To tell us about that is our economist, Paul Prentice, who just did an incredible report on the cost of COVID shutdowns here in Colorado.
Yeah,
Paul, thanks.
So, I wish your introduction was true. But as we dug into it, John, the cost was much more than we had anticipated. And it's really focused on people that could afford it the least.
So let's try to get a scope of this first, because while this was happening, I know we're looking in the rearview mirror. Sadly, when you want to take a look at the costs of things, you need to look at lagging indicators, and these are lagging indicators. But the question was, the shutdowns that the government forced here in Colorado, what kind of long-term damage or benefit did they have? And you got tasked with figuring out that simple little question. And so, were there winners? Were there losers? Who won? Who lost? But let's just go back in history for people who forgot last year. Colorado was basically shut down, except if you were a big company, if you were essential. So for some reason, Walmart could stay open, but the small store couldn't. It was all sorts of weird stuff. What happened last year as far as lockdown orders, just to give us a starting point?
Well, the initial was sort of the 2-week federal lockdown to flatten the curve, which eventually in some states, the 2 weeks became 52 and then almost 70 weeks in some states. We weren't quite that bad. We were about in the middle of the pack in terms of the severity and length of our lockdown, but it was bad enough to create some significant damage, and to your kind of opening question, some serious long-term damage to people who could afford it the least.
When you say afford it the least, who are we talking about? So I remember if you owned a restaurant, it was really bad for you. It was tough because you couldn't stay open and you had a service job, but they were all bailed out. They all got money. The federal government just dumped buckets of money on people. So there really shouldn't have been any long-term costs. Nobody should have lost, given the amount of money that was created and dumped into Colorado businesses.
So the dumping of what we call fiat currency into the economy is kind of a separate issue that we talked about at one point. You can't just print money and throw it at an economy and expect that to have a good long-term impact. The fact is, I interviewed this tremendous couple, that minority couple, who had put their life savings into a small business and then expanded it to 2 locations just before they got locked down.
What kind of business
was it? And they
was
lost it all.
They lost it all?
It was a restaurant. Yeah.
So they had a restaurant, they invested their lives.
They mortgaged their house, they started living in an apartment, they got a special needs child. It was their American dream, John. And they were successful, and they had expanded into a second location, and
they were taking risk.
Yes.
They were creating jobs.
Yes, 35 jobs.
35 jobs.
Yeah, for low-income people, by the way.
Why do you say low-income people?
Because those are low-paying jobs, pretty much the service sector jobs.
You're talking about waiters, waitresses, busboys, line cooks.
Yeah, entry-level jobs primarily. Yeah.
Help me understand that, though. Let's go with that example for just a second. Help me understand how they could have lost it all. We had bailouts. They had the PPP money. They had workers' comp for their, unemployment for their employees. So they should have been able to ride that shutdown.
No. So all of that money did not go where it was supposed to go. A lot of it went other places, and the people that needed the most mostly didn't get it. And I've got an example of one of my own boys in Las Vegas who lost his business, or almost lost it, even though he had some of the bailout money.
Tell me about that.
Just too hard.
Curious.
It's just too hard.
What do you mean it's just too hard?
the people that do these kind of policies, John, they believe the economy is some kind of mechanical or electromechanical machine that they can turn on and off and move something from here to there and everything will be the same.
In other words, we close it down here,
Yeah.
but we put in money over
there
here.
and
That'll
we'll all be
stimulate the
fine,
machine,
yeah.
and those people we close down here will be fine.
Sure, that worked in Zimbabwe, didn't it? But that's the kind of sort of neo-Keynesian thinking, if you will, on about how an economy works, and it's completely wrong. It destroyed thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lives here in Colorado, of livelihoods and actual physical lives as well. It's horrifying, John, what we found.
Right.
I encourage you to read the report. Everybody,
The report, by the way,
everybody watch it.
go to thinkfreedom.org, and the report is there, and it's worth diving into. So let's dive into this. We asked you to look at this question. What is the long term? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? You've given us this kind of outline of, well, working people are the ones that seem to have taken it on the chin. Service industry folks. Are there any industries or people that actually did better throughout COVID? I mean, if you were the owners of Zoom, the online platform for meeting, you would have done well.
Absolutely.
There were winners. If you were working for Pfizer or Moderna, you probably did pretty well. So in Colorado, who did well and how did you measure it?
So we looked at 50 of the largest companies that were headquartered, based in Colorado.
Companies like what?
Mostly primarily tech companies. I'm not going to name them right now, and I didn't name them in the report for a reason. But their shareholder value and their wealth went up 40-something%. 40%.
During the shutdown?
During the shutdown, while people lost their jobs. 450,000 people lost their jobs, John. 40,000 small businesses were closed, and these guys just got wealthier and wealthier. It's just a crying shame. It's
right.
I mean, as an economist, I'm trying.
I know how you pinkos are in academia. I understand how you hate rich people.
I'm trying not to be emotional.
I know how you communists hate corporations and rich guys. But you're telling me that these companies, the largest companies, during the shutdown, they did really, really well. That is, their value went up, their profitability went up. That's a good thing, isn't it?
Except it came at the expense of other people in the economy. It's not because they didn't just go up because they were better. They went up because their competition was shut down. It was not an organic increase in wealth. It was a transfer of wealth.
Are you telling me that the lockdown orders, weren't blanket orders? It seemed to me that the orders were attempted to be blanket orders. Hey, big guy, small guy, here are the new rules. Here's what we're going to have to do. Was it not that way?
Not at all. Not at all.
Give me some meat on that.
So
Explain it to me.
even at the retail level, the large box stores were allowed to stay open, but your little shops around the corner were not.
Say that again. Because
your big restaurants, chains were allowed to stay open under certain circumstances, while others were completely closed and fined into non-existence. The couple I was mentioning earlier, they ended up losing their entire business. They weren't just shut down and lost some money. They lost their dream.
Walmart could stay open.
Yep.
Bob's Five and Dime couldn't.
Exactly.
So Olive Garden could open up in different places in the state, but the other ones couldn't. Was that on purpose, or was it just that they had more capital saved up, that they were, because they had these economies of agglomeration, that they were bigger and they had more wealth, they had more lawyers to get them out of cases?
Well, that would allow them to survive longer, but the fact is they were never at risk of being shut down. The shutdown orders did not apply. They were excluded
from essential businesses.
Yes.
And
yes.
Walmart was essential.
Yes, but the neighborhood mom and pop store wasn't.
So add numbers to this. You said tens of thousands of people. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of that is coming back. You have to admit, don't you, Paul Prentice? You have to admit that the employment situation around the country, and even here in Colorado, even though it's lagging the rest of the country, is much better than it was even a few months ago.
Well, we've just recently come back to pre-pandemic levels. So we've lost a year and a half of employment growth. And it's not enough as an economist just to compare before and after. You have to compare with and without, what might have happened without it in terms of the trends that were occurring before. And if you measure it from that, the losses were even bigger because we had a roaring economy, if you remember.
I remember.
I mean, we were growing at 4.5% a year, and we had tremendous wage growth and employment growth.
Here in Colorado.
Here in Colorado. And all of that stopped and declined. And if we had been able to continue that, the opportunity cost of the losses could be measured as being even larger than what we can measure right now.
Now, if one big company goes under, it affects a lot of people. The restaurant you talked about had 35 employees. If it's IBM or Budweiser or some other place here, it could be thousands of employees. So is it fair to compare those businesses with small businesses? Because even if a small business goes down, it's a small amount of people compared to the large companies that not only survived but thrived during that time.
So people tend to think that way because they can see the large company and the large employment from it, but you don't see the summation of all the small companies. It's actually larger. Employment and increases in employment in Colorado and in the U.S. economy are larger for the small businesses than for the stagnant large businesses. They're just big and visible.
So in politics, we call it public choice theory.
Yes.
Which is, the masses can't afford a lobbyist, a concentrated interest can. Mm-hmm. And so in the same way, mom and pop stores and restaurants and manufacturers, the guy who owns it is also the guy who does the accounting, who also does the advertising, who also tries to do illegal, and he just doesn't have time. So give me the numbers again. At the end of the day, after the lockdowns, how many of the big companies went out of business? How many of the small companies went out of business? I mean, talking out of business. Yeah,
I'm not sure I have that exact data, but we do know that 40,000 small businesses were lost in Colorado.
40,000 small businesses.
Each one of those represents a human being, a family, and their dreams. It's not just a data point, a statistic. I don't know for sure of any large businesses that went out of business. There might have been some, I'm not sure. But to me, it's the economic crime, if you will.
Why is it an economic crime?
Because it's a destruction of people's lives. 450,000 people lost their jobs, and it was not the high-tech oligarchs. It was not the people running these big corporations. It was people with small jobs in small places, and they added up to a lot.
People who could work from home, because when they went to the office, if you looked at them all day, they would be tapping on a keyboard, talking on a phone, or talking face-to-face to somebody. If you had no idea what they were doing and you came here from Mars, that's what they did all day. And they could do that from home. Not as well, but largely. They're tapping on keyboards, they're making phone calls, and they're talking to people via Zoom. The people you're talking about are guys who take beans out of here and put it onto a tortilla shell over there, which you can't do over the phone. These were the service jobs that really got cut. And so I live in Boulder. Boulder is full of guys who can work from home. I have a feeling in Five Points and in Aurora and maybe Pueblo and places, that's not always the case. And even in places like Boulder, you still have people with restaurants. So you said 10,000 or 40,000. 40,000 businesses closed. Any idea how many employees on average per each?
No, we don't have that kind of breakdown. I think, John, a lot of this, the subsequent years, a lot of this data is going to be dug out and found out. So this report really is just kind of opening the door to this kind of analysis and thinking. And that in 2 or 3 years we'll have a lot more information. We use the data we could find and the survey data we could find, but we don't know exactly that. We do know that your point about people could stay home and do this on their computers versus people who had to physically work for a living. We found that by income class, higher income people had much more access to technology and systems and internet access, and lower income people had much less. So right there is just widen that gap. And then the same with access to the internet as well as the IT equipment that was associated with it.
The computers, the cameras,
just all of that infrastructure.
The broadband needed to do it. I've known you for decades, and I never thought of you as one of those pinko communists who is just always pushing for the oppressed. But what I'm hearing here is exactly that, and it's really. Let me do my rant.
Yes.
The left hates poor people. They make it really clear. They despise poor people. They hate poor people, and this is yet another example that it was the poorest in Colorado that have now lost their jobs. And those people who are mom and pop, 40,000 of those mom and pop businesses are gone forever? Question mark.
The couple I spoke to are going to try to restart again somewhere, sometime,
with
someplace.
What collateral?
With what, right?
If you lose your house, you lose your house.
So I don't. Those particular businesses are likely gone forever. The entrepreneurs behind them may recover and do something. It's not really clear. But to your point, I don't know the purpose of the lockdown was designed to hurt poor people, but there's no question that was the outcome. And that's the gist of our report. It's the unequal opportunities and the unequal outcomes that have been created by this. And so it's not because a market economy let some people get rich and some not. I'm all for that. This was policy driven. It was enforced at gunpoint by government officials. It's not right.
Is there a dollar amount here? Now that we have 40,000 businesses that are no longer because of the lockdown orders. And maybe people believe the lockdown orders were necessary. Some people think they weren't. For whatever reason, 40,000 businesses. Put a price tag on that for me. What did Colorado, I mean, forget about those. I don't know what it is with you and people. You care about the people and their dreams and their American. Let's talk dollars and cents. What did Colorado lose here?
Yeah, I can do the dollars and cents. We lost, at a minimum, $20 billion of economic activity.
$20 billion.
Billion.
With a B.
Yes, with a B.
Over the course of years?
During the first 6 months of the lockdown, so that was kind of the annualized loss of real GDP. It started to come back a bit after that.
So in 1 year?
That was peak to trough, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's huge.
$20 billion.
That's real money even to a politician.
All right. So even those of us who hate people and don't care if their dreams get shattered and they go to the poorhouse, you're telling me that $20 billion of economic activity ceased to happen in Colorado because of lockdowns. At the same time, the largest companies in Colorado, those that are most connected, those that are best able to work the system, that have the connections, that have the lawyers, they grew by how much?
Well, their values grew by 40 to 45%. It was huge. And it's hard not to see that was a transfer of income, not a creation of income.
So the lesson is, again, be a rich guy that owns a huge corporation in the tech field. Don't be somebody in the service industry that wants to give back to your community by risking all you have to have a restaurant and provide service and food to your neighbors.
Yeah, perhaps that might be the lesson. We found some other interesting things that tremendous disparity in by income class and by minority status.
Really? Tell me about that.
Tremendous disparity as to who did forego medical treatment. Foregone cancer screenings, foregone heart problems.
These are people who didn't get treatment because of the lockdown.
Right. And so we don't know, John, the final result of this. The $20 billion I threw out there, that's the down payment. Right? We don't know. The final result of this is
you mentioned
the lost health, the lost education. I could go on forever. Read the report. It's fantastic.
It's a fantastic report. When you say there's differences in income categories, even with health.
Yes.
So you're telling me rich guys somehow found a way to go get the treatment they needed during that time. Working families, poor people, ended up missing those needed medical procedures.
Right. What the wealthy did not forego as much medical treatment as the lower classes did, and then by race as well.
How did you measure that? I'm curious.
That was from survey data that we got, a household survey. The Census Department started collecting data in the early stages of the pandemic, and they broke it down by state. And so thanks to our wonderful Independence Institute research intern.
Who was that kid you exploited, by the way?
His name is James Royal, and he's from the University of Chicago. And so if Milton Friedman left a legacy there, he did a good job. This guy was fantastic. So I'll give a lot of credit. Give a lot of credit to Jim.
How did we compare to other states? So, all right,
Yeah.
we're angry that 40,000 businesses were shuttered because of this and lives lost. But we did better than any other state in the country.
No,
I've read the press releases. We have done better than any other state in the country.
Well, then everything's okay.
Everything's fine.
Except it's not. We looked at data that we broke down degree of lockdown states between the highest lockdown and the lowest lockdown by a performance measure of how many mask mandates, shutdown, lockdown orders, et cetera, et cetera. Colorado was about in the middle there. And the states that had less lockdown stringency had much less economic damage. The states that had...
Shocked. Wait a second. Let me see if I understand this. I don't have the PhD like you have, Paul, so let me see if I got this one.
Who knew?
Those states that had fewer regulations had more economic growth and less economic pain. Is that?
Absolutely.
And fewer people lost their jobs.
Absolutely.
Fewer businesses were destroyed.
Absolutely.
But somehow those states that had more rigid lockdowns had more business closures.
Much worse economic outcomes, much worse. And it's very measurable. And so we categorized them into the top tier and showed Colorado in the bottom tier. The data's in the report.
And where were we in all that?
We were right about the middle. Colorado was about there. A lot of states were worse than us, and some were better. So we were number 24 out of 50 in terms of stringency of lockdown. So just a little bit little bit ahead of the middle in terms of stringency.
All right. The next pandemic comes. People are scared. And it's one thing to look backward in time and go, we should have done that. We should have done that. We forget that in the fog of war, you don't really know what's right, what's wrong, what's effective, what isn't effective, because we don't know what we're dealing with. Is this a Black Death? We saw the pictures from the hospitals in Italy. We don't want that. And so going forward, if there is a similar pandemic and it scares us that much, it's fine to say, we solved it now. It wasn't, we got the vaccine. What's the lesson for the future?
Well, that's a great question, and perhaps the subject of a study by the Health Institute further down the road. We showed statistically there is absolutely no relationship between the stringency of the lockdown and the health outcomes of the population. There was no benefit to it on net. So
say that again, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me how you came up with that.
We found no correlation, no statistically significant correlation between the degree of economic lockdown and the health outcomes as measured by deaths per population unit. None.
So those states that had no lockdowns versus those that had the most stringent, pretty much the same.
Yep. There is no correlation.
That's not what I heard in the media.
I know. What is it about that media?
That's not what I heard at all.
We need better
How did you
media.
measure that, by the way?
So the stringency degree of lockdown was from a survey and a group that put together a metric of that on a scale from 0 to 100. And the deaths per population unit are CDC deaths. So our research intern and I worked in digging that up and made a little chart out of it.
So, are you saying next pandemic, do nothing?
Sweden. So we did not go into this in the report that much because we were looking at the costs of the lockdown. So we mentioned that there was not very much measurable benefit from it, and it takes a special kind of policy to create a system that's all cost and no benefit. That takes a special kind of political intelligence, doesn't it? But
And
that's
this was
what we
all
have here.
cost,
That's
no
what we
benefit.
have here. All costs and no measurable benefit. You could look at it state by state in the U.S. You could look at it country by country around the world. Sweden has got one of the best models ever. Right now, one of the states with the lowest death rates is one of the most open states is Florida. And they've got the most at-risk population, John, because it's people like me.
Young, good-looking people?
That's right. That's exactly
All
right.
right. Let's go ahead, just jump ahead. Polis's administration and all the other lockdown folks are going to read your report, and they're going to say, this is false. What is the one thing they're going to say that of why this isn't going to work? I want to expect what they're going to say. What are they going to say?
So they're going to try to say that, and they may say it, but inconveniently, we've got 26 high-level citations. We did really a very academic investigation of this issue. You know, preconceived was, sure, there was damage, but we had no idea what we'd actually find. No idea.
It was worse than you thought.
Absolutely worse
That's
than we
it,
thought, and concentrated where you could kind of see that was probably true, but then the actual data was even more shocking than we thought it was going to be.
That says a lot, because I know how much you were looking forward to seeing this. And if it's worse than what you thought it was going to be, I can only imagine how bad that really is.
That's the dismal science.
That's the dismal science. All right, one last thing, then we'll wrap it up. We touched on this in the beginning. What's going to happen next? You know, we don't work in a vacuum here in Colorado. We don't live in a vacuum. We've got this very loose monetary policy. And I know the feds are going to taper this down as they just passed a $1 trillion so-called infrastructure bill. We've got 40,000 businesses destroyed, companies doing well that are connected. We have all the money in the system. Where does that leave Colorado? A year from now, what is Colorado's economic?
Probably next year we'll make the stagflation of the Jimmy Carter era look like a cakewalk.
That is a hell of a statement.
It is, because then we had stagflation, which was a stagnant economy and roaring inflation. I believe we're actually heading into roaring inflation with a declining economy. I think we'll be in recession. Can't guarantee it here in Colorado in the sense of knowing how things are going to work out regionally, but I honestly believe the U.S. economy is headed for a major recession, not just stagnation, but a decline. And while the inflation is just 5, 10, 15% heading, it's already almost there. It's already almost there.
Did I hear you say 15?
Yeah.
I remember 12% inflation as a kid.
Yeah.
Fortunately, it was Dad's problem, not my problem. This is terrifying. What I see is, in order to fight the inflation, the Fed is going to have to do things that make a recession stronger.
It's going to hurt, isn't it?
And it's going to hurt. And that, I don't think people quite get, when the Fed is loose with money, big companies especially love it. Wall Street loves it.
Wall Street absolutely loves it.
And what it does, the first sign of inflation is in equities. So don't tell me that Facebook somehow is worth double what it was worth last year. They don't own that much more. Yeah, they're giving more services, but that is truly the inflation of the monetary system. Now that's starting to trickle down to silly things like my gasoline and my food and those things, which, by the way, the feds don't count as inflation, which I just love, because nobody has to buy food and fuel. And then that starts creeping down. And when it does, the feds are going to be incentivized to constrict that money supply. When they constrict it, the economy doesn't move as fast. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so in order to kill off a rising inflation, you have to restrict the money supply, and when you do that, the short-term effect is to tank the economy. The argument is you have to do that in order to come back stronger later. That's what we found under Reagan. It's exactly what has to be done, and his famous phrase was, if not us, who? If not now, when? We need some political leader that can stand up to stop this before it becomes worse.
What did Paul Volcker do? And if I recall, Paul Volcker was a Jimmy Carter pick that Reagan supported and kept as chairman of the Fed. If I recall, and I might not get this right, he pushed interest rates, not just trying to catch up with inflation, he took a big leapfrog above it. And all of a sudden we've got 20% interest rates and everybody's screaming they can't buy a house, they can't invest in business, and inflation went back down. Do I have that basically right?
Pretty much. Keep in mind the Federal Reserve does not control interest rates directly. It's an indirect policy result of tightening the money supply. You tighten the supply of something, the price of it goes up. Right? So that's what they did. They tightened the money supply enough, and the result of that was at one point a peak prime rate of a little over 20%, if you can imagine that. But keep in mind that was 20% when inflation was 15, 16% for a couple of months during that period. It was still enough to slow the economy down, to stop the inflation, and then just restructure and regrow. But it was tough. It was tough.
Times.
It was tough. I think we're heading into something like that, I'm afraid.
And if Reagan/Volcker did not do that, we would have had that stagflation last a lot longer and hurt more people.
It would have hurt a lot more people and perhaps even destroyed the economy. Who knows for sure? We'll never know because it never was allowed to happen.
Well, we might get our chance coming up soon.
Yeah.
Hey, Paul, thank you for this report. Again, check it out on thinkfreedom.org. What COVID really cost the state of Colorado. It's not a pretty picture, but it's important to do that accounting because no one wants to do a cost-benefit analysis of the COVID lockdown.
That's right.
Nobody wants to ask the simple question, what did we do better or worse for this? Because we know the answer, and now for at least one state, we've got the answer, and you can tell why nobody wants this to happen. I'm so glad you did this report, Paul.
Thank you for helping sponsor it. Thank you. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.